T.D. Jakes stunned by Ibrahim Traoré's revelation about Christianity. What he said will shake you. The stage lights were blinding, but what was about to be said would burn even brighter. Millions tuned in. Some expected polite words. What they received was fire. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, looked straight into the camera and declared that Jesus was no colonizer, no oppressor. He was a liberator. And if the church was not standing with the poor, the hungry, the rejected, then the church was nothing more than entertainment. The room gasped. Social media erupted. Hashtags exploded. And for the first time in years, Christianity itself was put on trial, not by atheists, but by a believer who refused to let Africa's soul remain in chains. Stay with us, because this is more than an interview. This is a revolution in thought, a call to faith with justice. Subscribe now and walk this road with us. The night was staged like a theater of history. Cameras swept across the hall, capturing faces filled with anticipation. In living rooms across Africa, in churches across America, in quiet corners of Europe, millions of people leaned forward. The announcement had traveled far and fast. Bishop T.D. Jakes, one of the most influential preachers of our time, was about to sit across from Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest president on the African continent, a man whose very name had begun to stir both admiration and alarm. Jakes was no stranger to the world's spotlight. He had spoken to presidents, advised kings, and inspired generations with his sermons on hope and perseverance. To the Black church in America, he represented both continuity and authority, a shepherd whose voice could bridge faith and society. Yet tonight, his role was not that of a preacher commanding a pulpit, but of a man with questions that millions had long been afraid to ask. Across from him, Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in his modest military uniform, radiated a different kind of presence. He was not polished for the cameras, nor softened for diplomacy. His rise to power in Burkina Faso had unsettled old powers. Some called him a revolutionary, others a rebel. Yet to many Africans, he embodied a rare courage, a leader who spoke not the language of appeasement, but the fire of liberation. And here, under the bright lights of global television, he was about to do what no politician had dared, challenge the spiritual inheritance of an entire continent. Jakes leaned forward first. His voice, calm and commanding, carried the weight of decades in ministry. "Mr. President," he began, "I have heard your speeches. I have seen the passion with which you talk about Africa's independence, about dignity, about breaking the chains of oppression. But tonight I want to step beyond politics. I want to ask you, what does Christianity mean to you and to your people in Burkina Faso?" A hush fell. It was the kind of silence that grips a room not with emptiness, but with expectation. Every ear strained, every eye locked on the young leader whose response could ignite controversy or carve a new path of clarity. Traoré inhaled slowly, adjusting his microphone, then turned, not only to Bishop Jakes, but to the millions watching across screens. His gaze was steady, almost piercing, as though he was speaking across centuries, across the struggles of generations past. "Bishop," he said, his tone low but resolute, "Christianity is not foreign to Africa. Long before the missionaries came, long before the colonizers wrapped chains around our wrists, we already knew the Creator. We prayed, we fasted, we honored the Almighty. What was later forced upon us was not faith, it was control." Murmurs rippled through the live audience. Some leaned forward in agreement, others stiffened as if hearing forbidden words. Jakes raised an eyebrow, sensing the sharp edge of what was about to come. "The Christianity that was introduced by conquest," Traoré continued, "was not the Christianity of Christ. It was the Christianity of empire. They carried the Bible in one hand and the whip in the other. They preached obedience while they stole our land. They told us to look to heaven while they built their empires on earth." The room shifted. Some gasped. Some nodded with tear-filled eyes, and some shook their heads, unwilling to hear a truth that cut so deeply into the memory of faith. Yet Traoré did not pause. His voice rose with conviction, echoing like a drumbeat. "I do not reject Christ. No, I reject the corruption of Christ's message. Jesus was not a colonizer. Jesus was not an oppressor. Jesus was a liberator. He stood with the poor. He defended the rejected. He lifted the forgotten. That, Bishop, is the Christianity Africa must reclaim. By now, the silence had broken into two currents, one of applause and one of unease. Social media feeds buzzed with fragments of his words. In churches across the diaspora, elders whispered to each other, some nodding, some frowning. The world was being confronted with a question it had long buried. Had Christianity in Africa been a tool of freedom or a chain of oppression? Jakes leaned back slightly. His expression was unreadable, half admiration, half hesitation. His fingers tapped against his chair as though he was weighing whether to challenge the young leader or let him continue. He knew this was no ordinary interview. This was a storm, and storms could either bring destruction or renewal. And then, with a calmness that only deepened the tension, Traore leaned closer to the microphone. "Bishop," he said, his voice now softer but carrying the force of truth, "Christianity without justice is incomplete. Christianity that tells the slave to obey but tells the master nothing of repentance, that is not the gospel of Jesus." The audience froze. For some, it was the boldest declaration of truth they had ever heard. For others, it was heresy. And at that moment, as the cameras zoomed in on his face, it became clear. This was not just a political leader speaking. This was a man placing the very soul of a continent on trial. But what he was about to say next would not only shake the room, it would send shockwaves through pulpits, parliaments, and living rooms across the world. The words had scarcely left his lips when the atmosphere shifted from anticipation to electricity. A gasp ran through the audience like a wave breaking against stone. Some clapped instinctively, their hands echoing as if to affirm what their hearts had always known but never dared to voice. Others sat frozen, their brows furrowed, their lips pressed tight, unable or unwilling to accept that their faith, the faith they had inherited for generations, could have been tainted by conquest. The broadcast chat rooms and social media feeds lit up in real time. On Twitter, hashtags were born before the moderators could even type them. #Troy Speaks, #Christianity Reclaimed, #Truth and Faith. WhatsApp groups across Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Atlanta buzzed with forwarded voice notes repeating his declaration. Jesus was not a colonizer. Jesus was a liberator. Some posted it with raised fists, others with skeptical frowns. The message was out, unstoppable, like wildfire carried by the wind. "T.D. Jakes, a man used to commanding his stage and guiding conversations, leaned back slightly in his chair. He studied Traore with eyes that carried both curiosity and caution. His fingers interlocked, his shoulders squared. Then, with a voice as deep as the sermons that had once shaken the pews of Dallas, he asked the question that hovered in every viewer's mind. "Mr. President, are you saying that Christianity as it has been practiced is false?" The question hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Every second felt stretched, as though time itself paused to hear what the young leader would say. Traore leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice unwavering. "I am saying this, Bishop," he replied. "Christianity without justice is incomplete. Christianity that preaches salvation but ignores oppression is not the Christianity of Jesus. Christianity that tells a slave to obey but tells the master nothing about repentance, that is not the gospel. And that, Bishop, is why Africa must rise, not only politically but spiritually. We must remove the chains not just from our land, but from our minds." The audience erupted. Applause thundered through the hall, but it was not unanimous. A woman in the front row shook her head, tears streaming down her face. An older pastor clenched his Bible tighter, muttering under his breath. Yet on the far side, young students rose to their feet, shouting, "Amen!" with hands raised high. Social media platforms quaked under the weight of debate. In Ghana, a popular radio host interrupted his music program to replay Traore's words live on air. In Chicago, a church group texted in disbelief, torn between shock and inspiration. In Paris, theologians prepared instant responses, calling his statements dangerous oversimplifications. But across rural Africa, farmers and mothers repeated his lines to one another as though hearing their own story spoken at last. Jakes did not interrupt. His eyes, though firm, carried the weight of recognition. For decades, he had preached empowerment, the breaking of barriers, the liberation of the oppressed. Yet here was a younger man, a political leader no less, reminding him and the entire watching world that the gospel was not decoration, not entertainment, but a call to justice. Traore, sensing the moment, pressed deeper. He raised his finger, tapping the table for emphasis. If your preaching does not liberate the African child from hunger, if your church does not fight for the farmer whose land is stolen, if your faith does not protect the African mother who dies in childbirth because hospitals lack resources, then your Christianity is just entertainment. And Africa has no more time for entertainment. We need truth. We need power. We need freedom. The words struck like thunder. Gasps filled the hall. Some shouted in affirmation. Others buried their faces in their hands. On Instagram, clips of the statement began circulating before the interview had even ended. Within minutes, tens of thousands had already shared it. T.D. Jakes leaned forward again, his brow furrowed. He was not angered, he was weighed down. He had spent decades speaking about liberation, but the boldness of Traoré's words cut deeper than a sermon. It was the raw cry of a continent. His lips parted, but no rebuttal came. For the first time in a long time, the great bishop sat not as a preacher, but as a listener. The tension in the hall grew thick. Some pastors in the audience shifted uneasily, knowing that their congregations were already texting, already debating. Would this ignite revival or rebellion? Was this young president rewriting the story of African Christianity before their very eyes? And then, just as the audience thought the fire had reached its peak, Traoré turned his gaze directly toward Jakes and spoke words that would pierce not only the bishop, but every believer watching worldwide. The echoes of Traoré's words did not stop at the walls of that brightly lit stage. They spilled into the streets of Ouagadougou, into the markets of Bobo-Dioulasso, into the quiet rural villages where radios crackled with late-night broadcasts. In Burkina Faso, where poverty still pressed hard on daily life, the president's voice became more than political rhetoric. It became a sermon of liberation. Young people, long weary of promises broken by leaders before him, repeated his phrases in cafes and classrooms. Jesus was not a colonizer. Jesus was a liberator, they said, their voices rising with conviction. To them, it was more than theology, it was identity. It was permission to reclaim what had been stolen, dignity, faith, and the belief that Africa could stand on its own feet. For mothers in crowded hospitals, for farmers struggling against foreign corporations, for teachers underpaid and under-resourced, his words carried weight. They did not need polished theology. They needed truth that spoke to their hunger, their land, their lives. The idea that Christianity must be measured not by cathedrals but by compassion, not by sermons but by justice, gave them language for frustrations they had buried too long. But the ripple did not stop there. Across the nation, churches began to feel the tremor. Some pastors embraced the call. They opened their church stores to feed the hungry. They organized cooperatives for farmers. They started literacy programs for children. They declared that true Christianity must be lived in the streets as well as in sanctuaries. Yet others reacted with fear, even anger. They saw Traoré's message as an intrusion into sacred ground. A president has no right to redefine the gospel, one bishop argued on a local radio show. His job is to govern, not to preach. These leaders warned of division, even schism. They feared losing both influence and wealth if congregations began demanding accountability. The political implications were unavoidable. Opposition figures accused Traoré of stirring unnecessary conflict between church and state. International analysts wrote hurried articles suggesting that Burkina Faso was entering dangerous territory, where religion and politics might fuse into instability. Yet among ordinary people, the sentiment was strikingly different. For many, it was the first time they had heard a leader speak not only of independence from foreign powers, but of independence from spiritual colonization. At the regional level, conversations intensified. Across West Africa, theologians compared his words with the liberation theology that once swept Latin America, where priests preached justice for the poor against oppressive regimes. Some argued that a new African liberation theology was being born, rooted not in imported doctrine, but in lived struggle. Others warned that such theology might ignite social unrest if churches resisted change. Economically, the impact was subtle yet real. Farmers began to question contracts signed with foreign companies that stripped them of land rights. Laborers whispered that faith meant more than obedience. It meant dignity. Students debated whether their universities should teach African spirituality alongside Christian doctrine. Politically, Traoré's message positioned him not only as a president but as a prophet-like figure. Supporters hailed him as the first African head of state in decades to speak openly against the spiritual chains of colonization. Critics warned that he was blurring lines between governance and preaching. Yet even they could not deny the resonance of his words among the masses. The struggle was not just theological, it was practical. Could hospitals improve because of a speech? Could schools change because of a declaration? On the ground, people began holding leaders accountable, not just politicians, but pastors too. If the president can say it, one market woman remarked, then I can ask my pastor why his church has food while my children go hungry. The debate spread like wildfire, touching both sacred pulpits and public squares. It was no longer about one man's opinion. It was about a continent grappling with its soul. And as Burkina Faso's people wrestled with this new vision, one question loomed over every conversation, whispered in homes, shouted in rallies, debated in Bible studies. Do you believe Africa has always been waiting for this kind of truth? Let us know in the comments. For while some feared division, others sensed something greater stirring, a movement that could not be contained within borders or denominations. But the ripples did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. The fire that began in Ouagadougou did not stay contained. By the next morning, newspapers in Washington, Paris, and London carried headlines about Ibrahim Traoré's confrontation with the legacy of colonial Christianity. For some, it was the voice of a prophet. For others, it was the rhetoric of a dangerous radical. Either way, the world was listening. In the United States, reactions were deeply divided. Many African-American pastors, long familiar with the language of liberation, found themselves nodding at Traoré's challenge. They recalled the civil rights preachers of the 1960s who had declared that faith without justice was hollow. Some even admitted that the young president had given voice to truths they themselves had softened for fear of losing congregations. But not all agreed. Prominent evangelical leaders, particularly those tied to large donor networks, criticized the speech as political manipulation. They accused Traoré of rewriting the gospel to serve nationalist ends. Television commentators questioned whether a president should ever preach theology on a world stage. And yet, the very fact that such debates were raging on primetime American news showed how deeply his words had pierced. Across Europe, the reaction carried a sharper edge. Former colonial powers heard in his message an indictment of their history. French and British commentators bristled at his charge that the Bible had been used as a weapon of conquest. Some politicians dismissed him as a populist seeking applause. Yet beneath the rhetoric there was unease, because his words resonated too strongly with those who had long lived under the shadow of colonial missions. In Africa, the impact was far more profound. From Ghana to South Africa, pastors convened emergency meetings to craft official responses. Some church councils praised Traoré for calling the church back to its roots of compassion and justice. Others warned that his words risked dividing congregations. Yet ordinary Africans were not waiting for official statements. They were already quoting his phrases in sermons, graffiti, and community gatherings. Internationally, analysts compared the moment to past theological revolutions. Just as liberation theology once reshaped Latin America, and the Black church once powered America's civil rights movement, some now argued that a new wave was emerging, an African theology of justice, born not in seminaries, but in the crucible of struggle. And what of the United States government? Officially, Washington remained silent. Yet behind closed doors, diplomats weighed the implications. Traoré was already a controversial figure for his resistance to Western influence in Burkina Faso. Now, by questioning the spiritual legacy of colonialism, he had struck at something deeper, the moral authority the West had long claimed over Africa. To some American strategists, this was more than a religious dispute. It was a battle for narrative, a contest over whether Africa would continue to see the West as moral teacher or rise as its own spiritual voice. As the debate raged, one reality became clear. The world was no longer speaking about Traore simply as a military leader or politician. They were speaking of him as a prophet-like figure, whether revered or reviled. And as the world argued, Africa stood at a crossroads. Would it bow to old narratives, or would it walk boldly into a future defined by its own truth? The storm of debate left Africa staring into a mirror. For the first time in generations, the question was not simply political or economic. It was spiritual. What kind of Christianity would define the continent's future? Would it remain chained to the memory of colonizers, or would it return to the liberating Christ that Traore had invoked? Three possible paths began to unfold before Africa. The first was the path of silence. Churches could choose to dismiss his words, clinging to traditions that served the powerful while ignoring the poor. This path promised stability for elites, but it would leave millions disillusioned, convinced that religion was only a mask for exploitation. The second path was one of division. Some congregations could embrace Traore's call, while others resisted. This would fracture communities, splitting families and churches along ideological lines. The risk of conflict was real, but so too was the chance for renewal. And then there was the third path, the path of rebirth. In this vision, Africa would rise to reclaim a faith that was not entertainment, but empowerment, not colonial inheritance, but divine inheritance. A faith rooted in action, where farmers, teachers, mothers, and elders all became carriers of truth. A faith that demanded justice and delivered freedom. A faith that could light the way not only for Africa, but for the world. This vision was not abstract. Already, whispers of a movement began to stir. Community kitchens run by churches, youth groups teaching history alongside scripture, farmers uniting under cooperatives inspired by biblical fellowship. It was not yet a revolution, but it was a seed. And seeds, when planted in the right soil, can grow into forests. In this unfolding story, one phrase rose above the noise: Africa, Christian liberation. For many, it became more than a slogan. It became a mission. A mission to reclaim Christ from the chains of empire, to restore him to the streets, the fields, the homes where he always belonged. As elders reflected, they remembered the prayers of their ancestors, the hope that one day Africa would not only be free in land, but free in spirit. For them, this was not rebellion, it was fulfillment. And in those prayers, the heartbeat of a continent grew stronger. Faith, justice, and freedom. Africa is not a dream, but a duty. The road ahead will not be easy. The forces of wealth and power will resist. Some pulpits will rage, some parliaments will sneer. But the choice now lies not in the hands of colonizers, nor even in the speeches of presidents. It lies in the people, the millions who must decide whether their faith will remain in chains or whether it will walk free. And as Africa takes its next step, the world is watching, waiting to see if this time the continent will write its own gospel of liberation. The broadcast ended, but the conversation did not. In homes, churches, markets, and mosques, the echo of Ibrahim Traoré's words lingered. They were more than sentences, they were sparks. Sparks that lit fires of reflection, of debate, of awakening. For the first time in a long time, Africa was not being told what to believe. Africa was telling the world what faith must become. This was not about rejecting Christianity. It was about reclaiming it, about peeling away the layers of conquest and greed to reveal the Christ who walked dusty roads, who fed the hungry, who stood with the rejected. It was about remembering that faith without justice is incomplete and religion without freedom is a cage. The journey ahead is uncertain. There will be resistance, from pulpits unwilling to change, from powers afraid of losing control. But there will also be courage, and that courage is already rising, not in the hands of the mighty, but in the hearts of ordinary people. Elders who remember the struggles of the past, children who refuse to inherit chains, communities who will no longer settle for entertainment when what they need is liberation. This, then, is the call of our time. Africa Christian liberation is not a slogan. It is a return, a redemption, a reclamation of truth. It is a reminder that the gospel is not property of empires, but a gift of God for every people, every tongue, every land. And in that call lies a greater promise, faith, justice, and freedom. Africa is not a dream whispered in prayer. It is a duty carried in action. A duty to feed, to heal, to teach, to defend. A duty to live as Christ lived, not in palaces but among the people. So let the world take note. Africa is not waiting for permission. Africa is not waiting for another Moses. Africa is choosing its own exodus, its own gospel, its own path. And in that choice, the world will see revival, not of noise and lights, but of love, truth, and freedom. If this story has stirred your soul, do not keep silent. Share, subscribe, and let the world hear Africa's new voice. Drop your words in the comments. New Africa, Africa rise, Africa can do it, because the time is not tomorrow, the time is now.